Runeslayer is a recently released game competing with Deepwoken indirectly through having parrying, I guess. In today's video, I'll be comparing both games in their PvP, PvE progression, and aesthetics to tell you guys which one's better or let you guys make the decision for yourself. Watch the new live channel video, and I'll be live after this video on Twitch. So let's get straight into it. Starting out with the PvE because it's the most prominent in Runeslayer and is supposed to be the most prominent in Deepwoken. Also, sorry for the thief progression footage. I tried getting more endgame recording and didn't realize my drive was full, so it didn't record anything. Anyway, the PvE in Runeslayer is actually more comparable to Rogue Lineage depending on what stage of the game you're in. In the early game, most enemies are easy to beat with parry and M1 skill trades like you would in Deepwoken. However, late game the enemies are pure hell. Most of them don't get properly stunned off of parries, do a ton of damage, and have a ton of health. Now this is for a reason. Runeslayer is based off of basic fantasy games in which parties are kinda required. So most of the late game enemies are meant to be fought by multiple people at a time, which makes sense when you think of the context of the game, but it's also kind of annoying when most enemies literally aren't made to be 1v1'd, because if you progress solo, it makes the endgame kind of unbearable, which also makes it less like Deepwoken and more like Rogue Lineage. Because in the endgame PvE, you kinda just have to focus on getting out of the way and kiting enemies in groups of people to fight, kinda like the Ice Dragon in Rogue Lineage. But at least rogue enemies were usually weak enough to 1v1, excluding that dragon. So, I mean, if you want to turn Rogue Lineage into Runeslayer, just give all the enemies 6 times as much health and make them one-shot you. Deepwoken PvE late game comes down to remembering simple patterns of bosses or having a build capable of beating waves of enemies. I don't really like either approach. Runeslayer makes late game solo progression less about skill and more about running back from spawn after you get 3-shot. Deepwoken is more so about hyper-specializing a build made specifically for boring enemy spam like the Diluvian mechanism. I guess at least Deepwoken makes it possible solo though, so I will say, both games have really good bosses that can be beat one-on-one. Excluding the Slime King from Runeslayer because, I mean, he's a product of his own creation since he's like the same in every game, seeing as how like King Slime is so like public domain and free to use that every like fantasy game has it. Even Terraria has it, and that's trash, right? And then I guess if we wanted to exclude bad bosses from Deepwoken, let's get rid of anything in the water. Now I think both games have serviceable PvE and bosses, which are fun, but become a bit too simple after you learn to beat them. But I mean, that's not really a bad thing, that's kind of just how video games get. Like, as you keep playing them, they get easier, so yeah. Overall, I'd give the PvE point a tie because both games have faults and differences to the point where they're not the most comparable from a PvE standpoint. Next up is the progression, since it ties into the PvE on each side. Both games are mainly PvE-based progression, but Runeslayer does not have any PvP-based progression, while Deepwoken progression can be done through only PvP if you really wanted to. Now, the PvP in these games is a lot more similar than the PvE. The PvP at its base is quite similar here. Both are parry-based, but Runeslayer is much more similar to Verse 1 Deepwoken combat in both the skills and the base mechanics. Now, with that being said, Deepwoken Verse 2 is very different than, you know, the original Verse 1 for a few reasons. Venting was the biggest addition added to Verse 2, which kind of made the devs feel more comfortable with experimenting with really over-the-top mantras, which is why Deepwoken feels super different and is way less stiff and more variable, because when you compare the old mantras to the new ones, we have bullshit like Flame Scourge and whatever the hell the new Gale Uppercut is, that mantra shouldn't have ever been added. So in comparison, Runeslayer is a lot more simple. However, the classes provide way more flexibility and gameplay style difference than anything in Deepwoken. There really isn't a ton of variety in Deepwoken's playstyle, and while there are different weapons, they all really just change your critical, especially when every build runs the same passive talents. But each class in Runeslayer has completely different passives, skills, and weapons. But every person in Deepwoken is running the same mantras per attunement, so while you can compare different classes to different attunements, at least the skills are pretty different, and there are like more optional side grades like weapon throw and triple weapon throw versus like the shuriken throw, for example, which is just what I am talking about because I've been using Thief recently. Now, Deepwoken's only side grades are modifiers, which don't usually change mantras that much. The biggest change is ironically being shadow mantras, because the only good side grades are Shadow Gun Multiplying Spark and Eclipse Kick modifiers. I do actually prefer the Runeslayer PvP for a few reasons though. First of all, it being more basic makes me enjoy it more. I stopped playing Deepwoken before Verse 2, and when Verse 2 dropped, the PvP was kinda jarring, so I much preferred Verse 1. Also, Verse 2 just has a lot of bullshit mantras. Runeslayer is just more fun because there's less of the stuff I don't like in Deepwoken that I've gotten bored of, which is why I barely play Deepwoken unless I'm doing a challenge on stream or getting background footage. I like the simple parry-based combat and variety that classes provide, And back to that last part about attunements being comparable to classes, there's like 3 clones of Wind Carved throughout other like attunements, so it's not much variety when you really look into it. And also, Runeslayer doesn't force you to PvP. Voidwalkers are just annoying and don't provide much to the game, but to be an annoyance, which is why it sucks not being able to stop them unless you get like Knives of Eyeless rep, which is like the worst faction to get rep with. They added Chime of Conflict as a way to allow them to focus on PvE and let the game be like PvE focused outside of Chime, then the people that wanted a lot of PvE could just play Chime. And then they added Voidwalkers, which forced me to fight power 8 users with crit blades while I'm progging a PvE build, and I could hit them like 6 times more than they hit me, but they just have a better weapon, so I'm losing. Look, I like PvE and PvP being separate, and Runeslayer does that well by not forcing you to do PvP. Forcing people who don't want to do PvE to PvP, and then forcing people who don't want to do PvP to do PvE are kind of like 2 separate things as well. Because like, okay, if you don't want to do PvE, then don't play the game. It's a PvE focused game. But then PvE players get forced to do PvP, which just kind of sucks. And this section is about PvP because I kind of went off the rails talking about progression and I just started comparing PvE and PvP. But overall, I like the simplicity, so I give the point for PvP to Runeslayer as of now. It could change if things get unbalanced. Next is actually the progression. I said I was going to do it earlier and I got caught up. I actually prefer Deepwoken's progression. In my opinion, most of the best parts of Runeslayer's PvE are optional, so going on a normal progression route and just doing quests as you find them actually isn't that fun, and it takes longer to reach max level than Deepwoken. And I don't really want to be killing beavers. So as far as progression goes, I like Deepwoken's more because I can do it for less time. Progression really is just work that you do to get to the fun part. Now, I do have one problem with Runeslayer's progression, and it's how much optional stuff is gotten through secret quests and how much stuff is gotten in the endgame. My biggest complaint by far is dual wielding. Why is it a semi-rare drop from the hardest enemy in the game, in the latest game area in the entire game? Like, that's what I have to do to put a weapon in my other hand. By the time I get dual wielding unlocked, I won't even be using that slot anymore because I'd be making another one. As long as it is an archer, I refuse to play that class. Anyway, it is fun if you do the secret stuff because the bosses in the game, especially the secret ones, are mostly optional. Like the Demon Claw boss fight, which is usually the best one in the game. If you disagree, you're wrong. Right? That's a good fight. But it's also optional, and if you're doing a regular progression route, you might not even find it. Now, as far as Deepwoken goes, the progression is about the same, but at least you can do the PvP for progression. Problem with that being is that by doing PvP progression, you're usually forcing people who don't want to do PvP, which is a worse experience for them in exchange for a better one for you, unless you use Chime to progress. But regardless, without Chime, it kind of creates an imbalance of people who don't want to be PvP players who are forced to do it, and people who only want to be PvP players forcing PvE players to fight in PvP. Take a shot every time I say PvP in this video. As a whole, I'd rather progress in Deepwoken though. It's just faster and I actually get to use the build I make after finishing it. Since even after power 20, there's still more progression through gear, and then there's like the various fun experiences like layer 2. But everything you progress towards in Runeslayer is kind of linear and you'll do during like your level progression. So by the time you're level 40, you'll already have everything you would ever want or need, giving you no reason to stay on your slot after beating the main quest. It's kind of like video games where you only get max level or like a special ability right at the end of the game for an end boss fight and you never actually get to use it. That's lame. Infamous Second Son did this with its third rock ability, and that sucked. Anyway, the point for progression goes to Deepwoken. Now the last part is going to be based on aesthetics. Runeslayer is kind of reminiscent of like old Roblox. Like when I see Runeslayer, I think of old fantasy Roblox games that use the really bad Roblox sword equipment that would make you float every time you clicked. It is simple looking, but it is kind of nostalgic and I do like it. I will complain about the rolling though as far as an aesthetic choice. There's no feedback difference between a roll and a roll cancel. The animation just kind of cuts. Which, by the way, why does the game even have a roll cancel? The roll functions like Rogue Lineage where there isn't really much as far as iframes, so when you dodge with a roll, you're usually trying to get out of the way rather than abuse iframes, especially since so many bosses have big-ass AoEs, or you can use it to like get in quickly. Which, now that I talk about it, the reason you can roll cancel is to make it easier to close distance, so ignore that point. Regardless, the lack of feedback on cancels without a noise or special animation is kind of annoying, because now I can't tell when people I'm fighting are doing it. Deepwoken's aesthetics aren't nostalgic, but they are very unique and I do quite like them. I do think they sometimes make unnecessary changes like the running animation, for example, which also wasn't tested because there was a very obvious bug with it on release. Overall, I do prefer Deepwoken's aesthetics because they're just polished, but I don't dislike Runeslayer's aesthetics. They're crude, but it kind of lets the game stand out because it's a modern game with an older style that makes it seem more unique, or it comes across as lazy. It really depends on how you see it. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you liked the video. Come check me out on Twitch. I'll be live right after this. Anyway, shoutouts to YouTube members Brick, Banana, Goobka, Drizzy Drake Fan, Pickle, and new Tier 2 member Green. I don't know why so many of my members are named after nouns or adjectives, but I love you all. And if you're watching this, even if you're not a member, I still love you. Have an amazing day, and goodbye.